There is a moment in an empath's life that almost no one notices, not because it lacks importance, but because it lacks noise. And from the outside, it looks like nothing more than a pause in conversation, a slightly longer silence, a decision not to respond the way they used to, yet internally it marks a permanent shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself with emotion, but with clarity. And that clarity begins in a place most people overlook: the realization that words, no matter how carefully chosen, no longer change the outcome. He had always been the one who explained, not casually, but deliberately, with precision, as if every sentence carried the weight of preserving the relationship itself. And if you watch closely, you would notice how he didn't just speak, he translated. He took something complex and emotional and reshaped it into something softer, something more acceptable, something that wouldn't trigger resistance, because somewhere along the way he learned that understanding doesn't just happen, it has to be guided, and so he guided it, again and again, adjusting tone, adding context, removing anything that might be misunderstood. But here's the part most people miss. This wasn't just communication. This was labor. And if you've ever observed this pattern in real time, you'll recognize it immediately. The way someone leans forward slightly, searching for the right phrasing. The way they repeat the same idea but with different words, hoping that this time it will land differently. And the question is, why do they do that? Why invest so much effort into being understood? And the answer isn't weakness. It's belief. The belief that if clarity is achieved, connection will follow, that misunderstanding is the only barrier, and once removed, everything stabilizes. But over time, something begins to repeat, not loudly, not all at once, but subtly enough that it can be ignored at first. The same conversations returning, the same explanations resurfacing, the same emotional effort being poured into slightly different versions of the same dialogue, and yet the result never changes. And that's where the shift begins. Not in frustration, but in observation. Because eventually he starts to notice a pattern that cannot be explained away by poor communication. What happens when you say something clearly, calmly, and consistently, and it's still received incorrectly, still minimized, still reshaped into something you never meant? Is that really a failure of expression? Or is something else happening underneath, something less comfortable to admit? Because there is a difference between someone who doesn't understand you and someone who has already decided not to. And once that distinction becomes visible, it changes everything. I've seen this play out in environments where communication should work. Conversations where one person lays everything out with care, removes ambiguity, answers every question before it's asked, and still walks away being told they were unclear. And if you pay attention, you start to realize that clarity was never the issue. The issue was perception. Because when someone is committed to seeing you a certain way, your words don't update their view. They get filtered through it. And that realization doesn't create an emotional reaction the way people expect. It doesn't explode outward. It contracts inward. Because suddenly every past conversation gets recontextualized. Every time he thought he just needed to explain better, now looks different, heavier, more deliberate on the other side. And instead of trying harder, something unexpected happens. He pauses, not to gather better words, but because for the first time, he's questioning whether words were ever the solution That pause is where the shift lives. Quiet, almost invisible, but irreversibly. Because once someone sees that effort isn't producing change, they stop assuming the problem is effort. And they start evaluating the dynamic itself. And in that moment, communication stops feeling like a bridge and starts feeling like a loop, one that keeps him engaged, invested, and emotionally active in something that isn't actually moving forward. And what replaces that realization isn't anger, it's something far more unsettling at first. A kind of stillness, where the urgency to explain simply disappears, not because he has nothing to say, but because he finally understands that saying more won't create what was never there to begin with. And in that space, without forcing another explanation, without reaching for another version of the same truth, he sees it clearly for what it is. What begins as care slowly turns into something far more demanding, though it rarely feels that way at first. Because over-explaining doesn't announce itself as a problem. It disguises itself as effort, as patience, as emotional intelligence, and if you were to watch him from the outside, you would likely describe him as thoughtful, articulate, even self-aware, someone who knows how to navigate difficult conversations with precision. But what you wouldn't see is the internal process required to produce that version of himself. The constant filtering, the editing, the anticipation of how each word might land before it's even spoken. Because explaining for him is never just about saying what he feels, it's about restructuring it, taking something raw and immediate and reshaping it into something controlled, something safe, something that won't trigger defensiveness in the other person. And that means every sentence goes through layers of adjustment, tone softened, intensity reduced, context expanded, examples added, all in an attempt to make the message easier to accept. And the question that often goes unasked is this: how much of himself has to be removed in that process for the explanation to be received? You can see it in small moments if you pay attention. The slight hesitation before he responds, the way he restarts a sentence mid-thought, not because he doesn't know what to say, but because he's recalibrating in real time, trying to predict the reaction before it happens. And that's where it shifts from communication into labor. Because now he's not just expressing himself, he's managing the emotional experience of the other person while doing it, carrying both sides of the interaction at once, and doing it so consistently that it begins to feel normal. At some point, he starts noticing something that's difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore: the exhaustion that follows conversations that should have been simple, the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from conflict, but from the effort of preventing it. And that's a different kind of strain entirely, because it's invisible. It doesn't look like stress. It looks like composure, but internally it accumulates, conversation after conversation, interaction after interaction, until he begins to feel something that doesn't match the surface of his behavior. What most people don't realize is that over-explaining isn't driven by confusion. It's driven by the need for reassurance. Not just that the other person understands, but that the interaction itself is stable, that nothing has been misinterpreted, that the connection hasn't shifted in some subtle, unspoken way. And so he adds more, clarifies more, refines more. Not because the message requires it, but because uncertainty feels heavier than the effort it takes to eliminate it. But here's where the pattern reveals its cost, because the more he explains, the more he conditions the dynamic, teaching the other person without either of them realizing it. That clarity is his responsibility, That understanding is something he must produce rather than something that should be mutual. And once that expectation is set, it rarely gets questioned. It simply becomes the baseline, the standard he is expected to maintain. I've seen this happen in conversations where one person does all the work, where every possible misunderstanding is preemptively addressed, every emotional nuance carefully laid out, and yet the response on the other side remains minimal, unchanged, almost passive, as if the effort being given has quietly replaced the need for effort in return. And that imbalance doesn't create immediate conflict, it creates dependency, a dynamic where one person carries the weight of connection, while the other simply participates in it. And over time, something begins to wear down, not dramatically, but steadily, because no matter how skilled he becomes at explaining, no matter how refined his language gets, he cannot compensate for a lack of engagement on the other side. And that's when the realization starts to form, slowly, almost reluctantly, that what he has been calling communication is no longer an exchange, it's a one-sided investment. And the return on that investment is diminishing with every interaction. At that point, the effort doesn't feel noble anymore. It feels excessive, not because explaining is wrong, but because it's being directed into a space where it isn't being matched. And once that imbalance becomes clear, the act itself begins to feel different, heavier, less natural, as if each word now carries the awareness of everything it costs to say it. And the question is no longer how to explain better, but why he's still explaining it all. When the effort to explain begins to fade, something else rises to the surface. And it's not relief, at least not immediately. It's discomfort, the kind that doesn't come from conflict with others, but from the sudden absence of something that once felt necessary, because for a long time, he wasn't just explaining to be understood. He was explaining to confirm that what he felt was real, and without that external response, without someone reflecting his experience back to him with agreement or acknowledgement, he's left alone with a question that feels unfamiliar. Can he trust what he already knows without needing anyone else to validate it? For most of his life, understanding was something that had to be mutual to feel legitimate. If he sensed something was off but no one else acknowledged it, he would hesitate. Not because his perception was weak, but because it was unconfirmed. And over time, that subtle hesitation turned into a habit, a quiet dependency on feedback, where his internal clarity became secondary to external agreement. And this is where the pattern deepens, because what looks like communication on the surface is actually a search for stability underneath. You can see it in the way he used to revisit the same point from different angles, not just to make it clearer for the other person, but to hear it echoed back in a way that reassures him, that tells him he's not misreading the situation, that his emotional response is justified, and that need doesn't come from insecurity in the way people assume. It comes from repeated exposure to environments where his experience was minimized, reframed, or quietly dismissed, until he learned, without realizing it, that his own perception required confirmation to be trusted. But once he stops explaining, that feedback loop disappears. And at first, that silence feels unstable, like stepping into a space where there are no markers, no signals telling him whether he's right or wrong. And this is where most people would retreat. I would go back to explaining just to restore that sense of orientation. But something different happens here. Because instead of reaching outward, he begins to observe inward, not in a dramatic way, but in small, almost unnoticeable moments where he pauses and lets his initial perception exist without immediately questioning it. And what he starts to notice is subtle but consistent, that the instincts he used to override were often accurate, that the moments he felt something shift in a conversation weren't imagined, that the discomfort he explained away had a source, and as those patterns begin to surface, not as isolated events, but as a sequence, his relationship with his own perception starts to change. Not suddenly, but steadily, like something recalibrating back into alignment. I've watched this happen in real interactions, where someone who used to overclarify suddenly becomes more direct, not more aggressive, just more certain, where their words carry less explanation but more weight, because they're no longer trying to make their experience acceptable. They're simply stating it, and that shift is almost imperceptible to someone who isn't paying attention. But it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. The need to be agreed with begins to lose its urgency, replaced by something quieter but far more stable. The recognition that disagreement does not invalidate perception, that someone else seeing things differently does not mean he was wrong to see what he saw. And this is where the internal authority starts to rebuild, not as confidence in the traditional sense, but as consistency, the ability to recognize a pattern and trust it without needing it to be confirmed externally. And once that shift takes hold, the questions he asks himself begin to change, moving away from, how do I make them understand this, and towards something far more grounded. Does this make sense to me? And that question carries a different kind of weight, because it doesn't rely on response. It doesn't depend on agreement. It simply requires honesty. And in that honesty, something stabilizes. What replaces validation is not isolation. It's clarity. The kind that doesn't need to be repeated, refined, or defended. And with that clarity, his words begin to change, not in volume, but in intention. Because he's no longer speaking to be reassured. He's speaking from a place that no longer requires it. Once self-trust begins to stabilize, something changes in a way that is often misread by everyone watching from the outside, because what replaces the constant need to explain is not louder communication, it's less of it. And that reduction doesn't come from withdrawal or emotional shutdown. It comes from precision, from an internal decision that not every moment deserves a response, and not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected in real time. And this is where silence starts to take on a completely different meaning. Before this shift, he used words as a tool to maintain connection, to manage perception, to soften edges before they became conflict. But now something more controlled begins to emerge. Not reactive, not urgent, but deliberate. Because when you no longer need external validation to confirm what you already understand, the pressure to respond immediately disappears. And in that space, silence stops feeling like avoidance and starts functioning as awareness. You can observe this in subtle interactions if you know what to look for. The moment where someone says something slightly dismissive, something that would have triggered a detailed explanation before, and instead of correcting it, he pauses, not passively, but attentively, as if he's watching the situation unfold rather than stepping in to shape it. And that pause reveals more than any explanation ever could, because without his intervention, the other person is left to continue to reveal their assumptions, their intentions, their level of understanding without guidance. And this is where silence becomes a filter, not a wall, because it doesn't block connection. It clarifies it. It shows who leans in with curiosity and who doubles down on their initial perception, who seeks to understand and who seeks to be right. And that distinction becomes visible only when the constant layer of explanation is removed, because before, his effort was compensating for the imbalance, smoothing over inconsistencies that now stand exposed. Most people misunderstand this phase completely. They see the reduction in communication and interpret it as distance, as émotionnel désengagement, sometimes even as indifference. But what they're actually witnessing is control, not over others, but over response, timing, and energy. Because communication at this level is no longer about expression alone, it's about discernment, about knowing when speaking adds clarity, and when it only feeds a dynamic that doesn't deserve continuation. There's a moment I've seen happen more than once, where someone tries to pull him back into the old pattern, asking for an explanation that he would have once given without hesitation, and instead of filling the space, he holds it. Not defensively, not with tension, but with a kind of quiet certainty, and that moment often creates discomfort on the other side. Because silence removes the structure they were relying on, it forces them to confront what they were previously able to avoid, and that's the part that shifts everything, because when you stop explaining, you're no longer managing how others perceive you. You're allowing their perception to exist without interference, and that can be revealing in ways that words never could, because now you're not shaping the narrative, you're observing it. And once you see it clearly, you don't feel the same urgency to correct it. This is why silence, in this context, isn't weakness. It's a boundary that doesn't need to be announced, because it's demonstrated through consistency, through the absence of unnecessary engagement, through the decision to let certain things remain unaddressed because addressing them would not change the outcome. And when used this way, silence carries more weight than explanation ever did, not because it says more, but because it refuses to say what no longer needs to be said. After silence becomes natural rather than intentional, the final shift begins to take shape in a way that is difficult to recognize unless you've experienced it from the inside, because what changes is not just how he communicates, but how he relates to everything that once pulled him in. And this is where emotional detachment emerges. Not as a defense mechanism, not as avoidance, but as a refined awareness of where his energy belongs and where it does not. Before this point, his connection to others was immediate and immersive. He didn't just notice emotions. He entered them, responded to them, adjusted himself around them, often without realizing how much of his own internal state was being shaped by what existed outside of him. And that level of sensitivity, while powerful, made it difficult to distinguish between what he felt and what he absorbed, creating a kind of emotional entanglement that blurred boundaries in ways that felt normal at the time, but costly in hindsight. What changes now is subtle but decisive. He still perceives everything with the same clarity, the same depth, but there is a space between perception and response that wasn't there before. A pause that allows him to decide whether something deserves his involvement, and that decision is no longer influenced by habit or expectation. It's guided by alignment, by a quiet internal check that asks not what needs to be fixed, but what is actually his to carry. You can see it in the way he moves through interactions that would have once consumed him, where someone brings tension into the conversation, where there's an undercurrent of inconsistency or manipulation, and instead of leaning in to resolve it, he acknowledges it internally and lets it exist without engaging. Not out of indifference, but out of recognition, because once you've seen the pattern enough times, you don't feel the need to step into it again just to confirm what you already know. There's a moment I've observed in situations like this where the shift becomes undeniable, where the other person expects the usual response, the explanation, the emotional effort, the attempt to restore balance, and instead, they're met with something quieter, more contained, a response that is present but not invested, aware but not entangled. And that difference creates a new dynamic entirely, one where the familiar cycle cannot continue because the participation that sustained it is no longer being offered. And this is where detachment is often misunderstood, because from the outside, it can look like distance, like disconnection, like he has become less responsive. But internally, the opposite is true. He is more aware than ever, more precise in what he allows to affect him. And that precision creates a kind of stability that wasn't possible before, because his emotional state is no longer dependent on how others behave or respond. What replaces that dependency is a form of independence that doesn't isolate him. It anchors him, allowing him to care without carrying, to understand without absorbing, to remain present without losing himself in the process. And that distinction changes everything. Because now his energy is not scattered across every interaction. It's directed, intentionnel, reserved for situations and people that meet him with the same level of awareness and consistency. Over time, this shift begins to influence not just how he responds, but what he attracts, because when someone is no longer available for dynamics that lack reciprocity, those dynamics either fade or transform. And what remains is different, not necessarily easier, but more aligned, more stable, less dependent on constant effort to sustain it. The need to be understood by everyone dissolves, not because he stopped valuing connection, but because he stopped confusing connection with access. And in that distinction, something returns to him that had been gradually given away over time, a sense of self that no longer requires negotiation, no longer needs to be adjusted to fit into someone else's perception, and no longer feels responsible for maintaining dynamics that were never balanced to begin with. He didn't lose his ability to feel, and he didn't lose his willingness to connect. But he no longer offers those parts of himself indiscriminately, because he finally understands that not every space is meant to hold what he carries. And once that understanding becomes clear, letting go doesn't feel like a decision anymore. It feels like alignment